back to story time with someone else's mom, with me, someone else's mom. We're reading Edward Eager's classic Half Magic. We just finished the first part of chapter 6, What Happened to Jane. We left the 4 children and Mr. Smith, we left 3 of the children and Mr. Smith outside the forbidding Greystone house, and Jane, who was not quite Jane anymore, inside the Greystone house. Mr. Smith knocked on the door. Let's see what happens next. When she who was no longer Jane turned out of Maplewood and into Virginia Street, she went straight to the Greystone house and up the blue gravel walk and in at the front door. After all, this was her house, and she lived here and belonged to this family now. She went in at the front door and up the front stairs to what was now her room. There were hand-woven curtains of a cold gray at the windows, and the walls were painted in the same colorless tint. There were no colored pictures on the walls, only sepia prints of Sir Galahad and a lady called Hope. The bookshelves were full of heavy, instructive-looking books. No toys or games, only a few sets of the helpful kind that show you how to weave linen or tool leather in 6 easy lessons. She who was no longer Jane sat down on an uncomfortable imitation antique chair and began looking at one of the instructive books. She did this as though it were perfectly natural and as though she'd been doing nothing else for years. But all the same, deep down inside her, she felt strangely empty and uncomfortable, as though she didn't belong in this prim gray room at all. After a bit, deciding she didn't feel like being instructed just now, she put down the book and took a round, shining object from her pocket. She sat staring at it for a long while. In a dim way, her mind connected it with the empty, uncomfortable feeling that seemed to hang over her, but she couldn't remember why the shiny thing made her feel lonely and unhappy. Of course, the trouble was that when she wished to belong to another family, she hadn't said a thing about not being Jane any longer. And so she had become the girl Jane would have been if she had been brought up in this cold gray house. But down inside her somewhere, the real Jane was still struggling to exist. This is called heredity versus environment, and it is quite a struggle. After she had been sitting by herself, or by her 2 selves, for a few minutes, a lady appeared in the door. She was dressed in a gown of sober gray wool. "Why, there you are," she cried. "Mother has been worried. She couldn't find her little comfort anywhere." "I was playing," said she who was now part Jane and part Mother's little comfort. Only from now on, I think it will save time if we just think of her as she. "Where were you playing?" said the gray lady. "You weren't in the solarium and you weren't in the patio." "I was around the corner. I was playing with some children." "But we don't know anyone around the corner," said the gray lady. "Mother wants you to have fresh air and exercise, of course, but one can't be too careful about speaking to strangers. Were they nice children?" She hesitated. "You wouldn't like them," she said finally, hanging her head and looking closer at the round, shining thing in her hand. "Really, Comfort, you're not behaving like yourself today," said the lady reproachfully. "I know it," said she unhappily. "Haven't I told you always to look at me when I am speaking to you?" the lady went on. "What is that you have in your hand?" "I don't know. I found it." "Let me see," said the lady. She took the shining thing in her hand. "But this is very interesting. It seems to be some kind of ancient talisman. See, there's writing on it, but I don't recognize the language. It's not Greek or Latin. Probably it is Sanskrit. Father will translate it for us when he comes home. And now, how would you like to take a nice nap until dinner time?" Jane and Mark and Catherine and Martha had all scorned naps for years, and the small remnant of Jane that was still there somewhere, buried under layers of little comfort, rose to the surface. "I wouldn't like it at all," she said. "But you always take a nap at this hour," cried the lady. "Do I?" said she, her heart sinking. "Couldn't I dig some worms and go fishing instead?" The lady looked shocked. "Why, Comfort, you know fishing is cruel, except when necessary to provide food, and we are all vegetarians here." "Build a block fort and have a war with toy soldiers?" suggested she, faintly. "Why, Comfort," cried the lady again, "there are no no toy soldiers in this house. They are symbols of world militarism and not suitable playthings. I can't think what has come over you today. It must be the influence of those bad children. No, let us go down to the drawing room and put this ancient talisman in the curio cabinet, and then you can practice your new piece until Father comes. The remnant of Jane that still existed didn't like seeing the round, shining thing go out of her possession at all, and she didn't much want to practice a new piece either. And she had her doubts about a house in which naps were taken and bright colors shunned, and things that were ordinary and fun were made to seem ugly and wicked. But she dejectedly followed the gray lady out of the room and down the stairway into the drawing room, which was large and cold and gray, and took her seat on the piano stool. And it turned out that practicing the piano, which was always sheer torment to Jane in the past, was a mere cinch now. She played away primly and perfectly, while the gray lady sat in a stiff chair of carved oak and looked at a magazine called The Outlook. This went on for what seemed like years, and the last trace of Jane was just beginning to think it might as well die away forever when there was an interruption. Someone had knocked at the front door. "Who could that be?" said the lady. "Father would use his key, and we'd never have visitors here." "I'll bet you don't," thought the small spark of Jane, with a last flicker of life. The lady went to the front door and opened it. A rather small gentleman stood outside. He wore a pointed beard and a nervous expression. "Good afternoon, madam," he said, putting one hand behind his back as though he were crossing his fingers, which he was. "I am writing a book on child psychology, and I hear you have a very intelligent daughter. I wonder if I might interview her." "How interesting!" cried the lady. "I have made a life study of child psychology myself." "You have?" said the small gentleman, looking more nervous. "Yes. What method do you follow, the Schwartz-McClumla or the Montessori?" The small gentleman looked as though he wished he were somewhere else. "I have my own method," he said. "You wouldn't have heard of it." "But how interesting!" cried the lady. "You must come in and tell me all about it." And she led the small gentleman through the gray hall into the gray drawing room. Outside, Catherine leaned out from her evergreen hiding place. "Psst," she said. "Come on," said Mark from behind his. And, followed by Martha, they crossed the emerald lawn and mounted the front steps of the house. The lady had left the front door ajar in her excitement, and standing in the hallway, the children could hear everything that happened in the drawing room perfectly. "Of course, we wouldn't want any publicity," the lady was saying. "You won't use her real name in the book, will you?" "Naturally not," said the voice of Mr. Smith, for of course the small gentleman was he. "I shall call her chapter The Jane Case." Mark and Catherine and Martha heard a gasp, as though the name had meant something to someone in that room. "Unless, of course, that is her name," Mr. Smith's voice went on. "Oh, no," said the voice of the lady. "We call her Comfort, but her name is Iphigenia." "If a what?" said Catherine to Mark in the front doorway. "Shh," said Mark. "I see," came the voice of Mr. Smith from the drawing room. "How do you do, Iphigenia? Do you believe in magic?" "Oh, no," came the voice of the lady before she could answer. "I'm afraid your method is a bit old-fashioned. Iphigenia, even I can't say it, has never believed in magic or anything else untrue." "How sad for her," said the voice of Mr. Smith. "However, what are her interests? Does she collect anything, perhaps?" "Why, yes," said the lady before she could answer again. "She collects objects of art. Only this afternoon, she brought home a rare talisman." In the doorway, Martha pinched Catherine. "The charm," she hissed. "Shh," Catherine hissed back. "You don't say." Mr. Smith's voice sounded excited. "I wonder if I might see it for a moment." "I don't see why not," came the voice of the lady. Her footsteps could be heard crossing the room, and the suspense was more than Mark and Catherine and Martha could bear. They moved across the hall to see what was happening. The floor of the hall was highly polished, and there were some little gray hand-hooked rugs scattered about it. Martha tripped on one of these and slipped to the floor, fell into the drawing room with a crash, just as the lady was turning from the curio cabinet with the charm in her hand, and Mr. Smith was reaching out his own eager hand to take it. Mark and Catherine followed Martha into the room. "Hello," said she, smiling at them. After half an hour in the gray house, she liked their looks better than she had at their last meeting. She turned to the gray lady. These are the children I was playing with this afternoon. Well, I'm afraid they are very rude children, said the lady, recovering from her surprise. She looked at Mark and Catherine and Martha sternly. In this house, we don't walk in the front door without being asked. I think you had better go home at once. Iphigenia doesn't want to see you. Oh, yes, she does, if she only knew it, said Mark bravely, advancing into the room. Let me take that charm a minute and I'll prove it. It belongs to us anyway. If you mean this rare old Sanskrit talisman, said the lady, it certainly does not. It belongs to my Iphigenia. Iphigenia. Blah, blah. She's not yours, she's ours, said Martha, getting up from the floor. Her name isn't what you said. It's Jane, said Catherine. She doesn't live here, she lives over on Maplewood, said Mark. Not another word, said the lady. Such awful fibbing I never heard. You are either the worst brought-up children I have ever seen, or you are all mentally unbalanced. I'm afraid I shall have to telephone your parents. No, don't do that, said Mr. Smith, coming forward anxiously. I'm afraid this is all my fault. I'm afraid I asked these children to come. Just a little experiment, you know, all part of my method. Then I don't think much of it, said the lady, getting really cross. I don't believe you are a child psychologist at all, or if you are, you shouldn't be allowed to be. I shall write to the Psychology Journal and complain. Very well, you're right. I'm not, said Mr. Smith, giving up. But don't be alarmed, I can explain everything. Only it's a long story, so if you'd just let me have the charm. So that's it, cried the lady. I see it all now. It's a plot. Coming here pretending to be writing a book, and all the time trying to steal our art treasures. For shame, taking advantage of these unfortunate children. No, said Mr. Smith, becoming agitated. This is all a mistake. This little girl isn't who you think she is at all. You wouldn't like her if you got to know her, put in Catherine earnestly. You would find her a wolf in sheep's clothing. She's my sister, only she has what-do-you-call-ems, said Mark. Hallucinations, explained Mr. Smith. We want to take her where they'll be kind to her, said Martha. Jane, come on home, out of this cold, slippery house. The remnant of Jane, down in the heart of Iphigenia, heard Martha's call. She thought how much happier she felt with Martha and Mark and Catherine. Yes, and Mr. Smith, too, than she did with this gray lady. She remembered her own home and her own family and wished she belonged to them again. She yearned to answer Martha, and she made a great effort and forced herself to the surface and started to speak. But before she could, there was an interruption. A thin, gray gentleman appeared in the drawing room. Yarworth, here you are at last, cried the gray lady. This criminal, aided by these delinquent children, was trying to rob our Iphigenia. Dear me, said the gray gentleman, retreating slightly. Are you sure? Don't just stand there, cried the lady. Defend us. What will Iphigenia think of her father? What Iphigenia would have thought of her father will probably never be known. For at that moment, Mr. Smith, having had quite enough of both Iphigenia and her parents, decided to act. I am sorry to appear rude, madam, but you'll be glad of it afterward, he said. At least, I hope so. And he snatched the charm from the lady's hand, took a deep breath, and wished that Jane might be twice as much Jane as she ever was. Jane, finding herself suddenly herself again, gave a glad cry and ran, much to the surprise of Mark and Catherine and Martha, straight to Mr. Smith. You were wonderful, she said. Part of me was here all along, hoping you'd save me, and you did. You were wonderful. It was nothing, said Mr. Smith modestly. We told you so, said Mark and Catherine to Jane. They had run to Mr. Smith too, and so had Martha, and now the five of them stood united, looking defiantly at the gray lady and the gray gentleman. The lady was blinking her eyes. The gentleman was rubbing his. They looked rather like two people who have just awakened from a nightmare. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Demanded the gray lady. What are you doing in our house? Go away at once. This isn't your little girl, then, said Mr. Smith, with his arm around Jane. The lady looked at Jane with distaste. I never saw this horrid thing before in my life. You don't even have a little girl, perhaps? Mr. Smith went on. Certainly not, the lady said thankfully. So noisy and tiresome and such a strain. Then if we take her away with us, it will be quite all right with you. If you don't all leave this house at once, my husband will take steps. Won't you, Yarworth? Said the gray lady. The gray gentleman took a step backwards in alarm. He did not reply. Thank you, madam. That's all I wanted to know, said Mr. Smith, and bowing politely, he touched the charm and made another wish. Of course, if he had asked the four children's advice, they could have told him how to word his second wish much better. As it was, being new to magic, he didn't put in any of the things experience had taught them, like not being gone too long and arriving back in a normal way and their mothers not noticing anything out of the ordinary. He just wished they were twice as far as home again. And so a split second later, when the children's mother came into the living room and it was empty, and then suddenly Mr. Smith and the four children were all sitting around it in chairs, she was more than a bit surprised. How funny, she said. I didn't see you sitting there. I didn't hear a car drive up either. She glanced out the window, and it was then that Mr. Smith remembered that his car was still sitting back on Virginia Street, where he'd parked it what seems like ages ago. He touched the charm in his pocket, made a quick wish, but not quick enough. When the children's mother looked from the window, first she saw the empty street, and then suddenly the car was sitting there. She put her hand to her head and sat down suddenly. I really must go to the doctor about my eyes. I keep seeing the strangest things. It's the sun, said Mr. Smith. It's awfully strong today. I've been thinking I saw some awfully strange things this morning, too, over on Virginia Street, said Mark daringly, with a wink at Mr. Smith. Martha giggled. Luncheon is served, Miss Bix said sourly from the doorway, and they all trooped in to where the festive board groaned. The luncheon party was a great success with the four children, but their mother seemed a bit worried and preoccupied and kept putting her hand to her forehead as if she were trying to puzzle something out, and this seemed to make Mr. Smith a bit worried too. The spirits of the children were so very high, however, that their mother couldn't stay upset for long, and the behavior of Jane in particular was enough to warm any mother's faltering heart. She was so unselfish about second helpings, so eager to pass things without being asked, so tireless in her efforts not to accept the last extra butterscotch tart lying luscious under its whipped cream, but to bestow it on a friend or relation, so anxious generally to show how much she loved this family above all others, that no one could believe it was the usual good old hasty, hot-tempered Jane who sat there among them. This charm certainly does improve people once they've been through the mill of it, Catherine whispered to Mark. Whispers at the table shall breakfast in the stable, said their mother. Kath was only saying Jane certainly was full of charm this morning, said Mark, with another daring wink at the others. Yes, you'd think that she were a different person, said Catherine, equally daring. Martha giggled. So, I regret to say, did Mr. Smith. What's the joke? Said the children's mother. Oh, nothing, said the four children. I'm just feeling happy, said Mr. Smith. This is a treat for me. I live all alone, you know, and it's years since I've been to a family party like this. Jane looked round the room at the colored pictures on the lemon-yellow walls and the gay painted curtains at the window and the bright rugs on the floor and the smiling faces around the table. This is a wonderful family to belong to, she said. It's the best family to belong to in the whole world. Then she smiled at Mr. Smith. I think you're going to think so, too, she said. And that concludes chapter 6. Guess what? There are only 7 chapters in this book. So we're almost done. But chapter 7 is, pretty long. At least I think there's only 7, unless there's an epilogue. 7 chapters. So next time, we'll dig right in to chapter 7, how it ended.